I never thought I'd end up best friends with someone like Brock Sullivan. The whole thing started during our senior year at Millfield High, when I was still convinced he was just another loud guy desperate for attention. Brock had this way of taking up space in every room he entered, cracking jokes that weren't always funny and telling stories that somehow always starred him as the hero. Most people either loved his energy or couldn't stand being around him for more than 5 minutes. I fell squarely into the second category. My opinion changed on a random Thursday afternoon in October. I was sitting alone in the library, working on a photography project about local architecture, when Brock dropped into the chair across from me. He'd been watching me flip through pictures of old downtown buildings for about 10 minutes before he finally spoke up. "You know there's an abandoned factory about 20 minutes outside town, right?" he said, keeping his voice low enough that Mrs. Henderson wouldn't kick him out. "Built in the 1940s, still has all the original machinery inside." I looked up from my photos, ready to brush him off with some polite excuse about being busy. But his face looked different somehow. His usual crazy smile was gone, and he seemed really interested. He was actually looking at my work instead of just waiting for his chance to talk. "How do you know what's inside?" I asked. "Because I've been there." He leaned forward, lowering his voice even more. "Last weekend, found a way in through a loading dock that doesn't lock properly anymore. Place is incredible, like stepping back in time." I looked at his face, trying to figure out if this was some big joke. Brock Sullivan didn't seem like someone who'd care about old buildings or architecture stuff. But he kept going on about the factory, talking about where everything was with crazy detail, bringing up things about the machines and how the sunlight shined through the busted windows upstairs. "Want to see it?" he asked. "This Saturday, I could show you around." Looking back, I should have said no. Should have stuck to photographing buildings from the outside, where breaking and entering wasn't involved. But something about the way he described that place made me curious. The idea of seeing industrial history preserved exactly as workers had left it decades ago really interested me, especially since I spent hours reading about local historical sites. "What if we get caught?" I asked. "We won't." His confidence was infectious. "Place has been empty for 15 years. Nobody checks on it anymore." That Saturday, I met Brock at the abandoned Millfield manufacturing plant, a big brick complex surrounded by chain-link fence and overgrown weeds. He'd been right about the loading dock. The metal door had warped enough over the years that it no longer sat flush in its frame. We squeezed through the gap, and I found myself standing in a huge room filled with rusted machinery and conveyor belts that ran into the dark areas. The place was everything Brock had promised and more. Decades of dust-covered workbenches where someone had left coffee cups and hand tools, as if the workers had simply stepped out for lunch and never returned. I spent 3 hours photographing everything, from the massive steam boilers to the time clock still mounted by the entrance, employee cards scattered on the floor beneath it. Brock turned out to be the perfect exploration partner. He knew how to move quietly through unstable areas and had a knack for finding the most interesting rooms. More importantly, he understood why these places mattered. While I focused on taking pictures of cool details, he researched the human stories. He'd found old newspaper articles about the plant's closure, knew which local families had worked there for generations. "These buildings are like time capsules," he said, as we climbed carefully up a metal staircase to the second floor. "Everyone just walks past them on the highway, but they're full of stories nobody bothers to learn." That afternoon changed everything between us. The annoying attention seeker from school turned out to be someone who really cared about finding forgotten pieces of history. His energy, which had seemed so obnoxious in the hallways, turned into catching enthusiasm when he focused on exploring and taking pictures. Over the next few months, we became unofficial partners. Brock would look up potential sites online or hear about them through the loose network of urban explorers he'd somehow connected with. I brought the photography skills and historical research that made our adventures more meaningful than just trespassing for thrills. We visited a closed-down textile mill in the next county, where looms still held half-finished fabric and personnel files from the 1980s were scattered across the front office. An abandoned elementary school outside town became our biggest project, with 3 floors of classrooms frozen in time, complete with lesson plans still written on whiteboards and children's artwork taped to bulletin boards. Each location taught us something new about the region's industrial past and the communities that had built their lives around these now empty buildings. But more than that, they taught us how to work together. Brock's willingness to take risks balanced my habit of overthinking every decision. My careful documentation went well with his knack for finding the most interesting spaces within larger structures. By graduation, we'd explored more than a dozen sites across 3 counties. What started as curiosity had become a real hobby, something we both looked forward to even with the risks. Even when we went to different colleges, we made time for weekend exploration trips whenever we were both back in town. The call came last Tuesday evening while I was editing photos from our most recent adventure, an old grain elevator that had been empty since the late 1990s. Brock's number showed up on my phone just after 8 o'clock. "I found it," he said without bothering with hello. "The one we've been waiting for." "Found what?" "Millfield General Hospital, the old psychiatric wing on the hill. I've been trying to get inside that place for 2 years. I knew the building he meant. Everyone in town knew it. The big brick building sat on a hill above Millfield's downtown. You could see it from almost anywhere in the valley. It had been empty for decades, but unlike our usual targets, this one came with stories that went beyond just being an old abandoned building. "Brock, that place is supposed to be haunted." I kept my voice neutral, not wanting to encourage what was probably going to be an argument about supernatural nonsense. "Come on, Ryan. You know that's just local folklore designed to keep people away from a structurally unsound building." His laugh carried over the phone. "Although I admit the stories are pretty creative. Patients who never died, voices calling from empty rooms, mysterious disappearances, classic small-town ghost tales." He was right, of course. Every abandoned building got its share of ghost stories, especially places with dark histories like the old hospital. But I had to admit the building interested me. It was huge, with cool details you could see even from far away, and I wondered what was still inside after being empty for so many years. "How would we even get in?" I asked. "That place has been locked up tight since the state shut it down." "Leave that to me. I've been studying the building's layout for months, found some old blueprints online, plus maintenance records from the final years of operation. There are definitely ways inside if you know where to look." I could hear the excitement building in his voice, the same tone he got whenever he found a good new site. But something about this felt different, bigger, more complicated than our usual weekend adventures. "When were you thinking?" I asked. "This Friday night. Gives us time to do proper research, gather all our equipment. I'm talking about a serious expedition here, not just a quick look around." The timing worked for me. I had no other plans for the weekend, and I had to admit that photographing the interior of Millfield's most infamous abandoned building would be a significant addition to my portfolio. But Brock wasn't finished selling the idea. "You're not getting cold feet, are you?" he asked. "Because I remember a time when you were excited about pushing boundaries, discovering places nobody else had documented. Lately, you've been playing it pretty safe." That stung more than I wanted to admit. He wasn't entirely wrong. Our recent explorations had been relatively tame, buildings that were easy to access and unlikely to attract serious legal consequences if we were caught. I'd been choosing sites that were interesting but safe, while Brock continued pushing for more challenging locations. "I'm not getting cold feet," I said. "I just think we should be smart about how we approach something this big." "Fair enough, but this is our chance to document something really significant. Think about it. The old hospital has been sealed up for years. Whatever's inside is probably exactly the way they left it when the state investigation shut the place down." He had a point. The hospital was a unique find for our history project. It was a huge building that had been empty for decades, Because of its scary reputation, hardly any vandals or other explorers had gone inside. "All right," I said. "Friday night. But we do this right. Full research, proper equipment, and we're careful about every step." "Absolutely. I'll start gathering everything we need. Cameras, extra batteries, heavy-duty flashlights. Maybe bring bolt cutters in case we run into any locked doors that are worth getting through." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment looking at the photos from our grain elevator trip. Each image showed details that would be lost if someone didn't take the time to capture them. That was what made our hobby mean something to me, saving stories that would otherwise disappear forever. The hospital was the biggest challenge we'd tried, but also had the biggest potential payoff. If we could safely get into and photograph the inside, we'd be creating a record of a building that most people would never see. I spent the rest of the week looking up everything I could find about Millfield General Hospital's history, layout, and why it was left empty. By Friday afternoon, I had 3 notebooks full of information and a complete equipment list. Brock was right about one thing. This was going to be our biggest exploration yet. I pulled into the gas station parking lot at exactly 8:30, spotting Brock's beat-up Honda Civic parked near the edge of the lot under a flickering streetlight. He was leaning against the driver's side door, a manila folder tucked under his arm and that familiar grin spreading across his face as I approached. "Right on time," he said, straightening up as I grabbed my camera bag from the passenger seat. "You ready for this?" The weight of my equipment felt reassuring across my shoulder. Camera body, extra lenses, backup batteries, and the small tripod I'd packed just in case we found something worth documenting properly. Brock looked like he'd dressed for a military operation, with cargo pants loaded with what I assumed were his lockpicks and various exploration tools, plus a heavy jacket that probably concealed more gear than I wanted to know about. "Let me see what you found," I said, nodding toward the folder. He opened it and pulled out several sheets of paper, putting them on the hood of his car. The floor plans looked real enough, but the photocopying made some details hard to see. I looked at the layout with my flashlight, seeing the main hallways, office areas, and what looked like patient wings coming from a central area. "These are from the county archives," Brock explained, pointing to various sections with his finger. "But look at this. The basement is marked as storage and utilities with no detailed layout, just blank space where there should be room specifications." He was right. The building's footprint suggested a big basement level, but the plans showed almost nothing about what was down there. I'd seen similar gaps in records before. Sometimes architectural plans were incomplete, especially for big buildings with complex mechanical systems. "Could be they never filed detailed basement plans," I said, "or the records got lost over the years." "Maybe. But I've been looking at satellite photos, and the building's foundation suggests there's a lot more space below ground than these plans show." Brock folded the papers and slipped them back into the folder. "Guess we'll find out when we get inside." The hospital stood tall against the dark sky as we drove the winding road up the hill, my headlights occasionally catching glimpses of the massive brick structure through the trees. Even from this distance, I could see broken windows scattered across its front, and sections where the roof had partially collapsed. The building looked exactly like what it was, a place that had been abandoned and forgotten for decades. We parked behind a cluster of pine trees about 200 yards from the main entrance, far enough from the road that my car wouldn't be visible to anyone driving by. The December air was freezing when I stepped outside, and our breath formed clouds that disappeared quickly in the cold wind. "Temperature's dropping fast," I said, adjusting my jacket and slinging the camera bag higher on my shoulder. "Good. Means fewer people out tonight to notice us poking around." Brock clicked on his flashlight and tested the beam, then pulled out a second light and handed it to me. "These are the high-powered ones. Should give us plenty of range inside." We approached the building on foot, our boots crunching through patches of snow that had accumulated in the shadows where the afternoon sun hadn't reached. The hospital looked even more imposing up close, with its dark brick walls rising 3 stories above us and wings extending in both directions from the main entrance. Most of the windows on the ground floor had been boarded up years ago, but time and weather had loosened many of the boards. The quiet felt absolute in a way that seemed unnatural. Millfields spread out in the valley below us, streetlights marking the grid of residential streets, but no sound carried up the hill. No traffic noise, no distant voices, not even the buzz of electrical equipment that you'd normally hear near any large building. "Dead zone," Brock said, following my gaze toward the town. "Sound doesn't travel well up here. Something about the way the hill is positioned." We walked around the building, checking boards on windows and looking for any way in that wouldn't involve breaking stuff. Most of the ground floor windows were shut tight, but near the building's south side we found what we needed. A window frame about 4 feet off the ground had no glass left in it, leaving a hole big enough for us to climb through. The wooden frame was rotting, and I could see what looked like an office with a desk against one wall. "Administrative wing," Brock said, consulting his floor plans. "Should connect to the main corridor system from here." I boosted myself up and through the window first, landing carefully on the debris-covered floor inside. The smell hit me immediately, a mixture of mold, water damage, and something else I couldn't identify. Decay, maybe? Or just the built-up smell of a building that had been sealed up and ignored for decades. Brock followed me through the window, and we both turned on our flashlights to get our first real look at the interior. Our lights showed a room that had clearly been an office, with a metal desk tilted against one wall and filing cabinets all over the place. Water stains covered the ceiling in dark patches, and sections of wallpaper hung in strips, showing the damaged plaster underneath. Papers covered the floor everywhere, mixed with chunks of fallen plaster and what looked like pieces of insulation that had come loose from the ceiling. I bent down and grabbed one of the sheets, finding it too water-damaged to read, though I could make out what might have been a patient intake form. "This is incredible," Brock said, immediately pulling out his camera and starting to document the scene. The flash illuminated the room in harsh bursts, revealing details our flashlights had missed. Graffiti covering one wall in layers, some of it obviously recent, and furniture stacked in corners as if someone had tried to barricade the windows from inside. I pulled out my own camera and began working through the space, taking pictures of the desk with its drawers hanging open and papers spilling onto the floor, the overturned filing cabinets, and the peeling paint that was probably green once, but now looked more like the color of old moss. Each shot captured a piece of the building's story, how quickly it was abandoned, how slowly it fell apart, and the occasional signs that other explorers had been here before us. But this room felt different from the industrial sites we usually photographed. More personal somehow, as if the people who'd worked here had left something of themselves behind. "Look at this," Brock called from near what had been a reception area. He was photographing an appointment book that lay open on a small table, its pages yellowed but still readable. "December 1987. Last entries are from right before Christmas." I went over to see what he'd found. The appointment book had a full schedule of meetings and patient appointments, with handwritten notes in the margins that showed normal daily work right up until the last entries. Then, nothing. Just blank pages for the rest of December and into the new year. "They shut down fast," I said, taking my own photos of the appointment book from different angles. "Looks like they were operating normally and then just stopped." The evidence of sudden abandonment was everywhere once we started looking for it. Coffee cups still sat on desks, though whatever had been in them had long since evaporated or been absorbed by the papers underneath. A coat hung on a hook by the door, and personal items, family photos, small decorations, a half-finished crossword puzzle, were scattered throughout the space as if people had simply walked away from their work and never returned. Brock had moved onto the doorway leading deeper into the building, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of what appeared to be a main corridor. I finished documenting the office space and joined him, looking out into a hallway that stretched beyond the range of our lights. "Main administrative corridor," he said, checking his floor plans. "Should lead to the patient wings and the central hub. You ready to see what else they left behind?" I adjusted my camera settings for the lower light conditions and checked that my extra batteries were easily accessible. Whatever we were about to discover in the deeper parts of the hospital, I wanted to make sure I could document it properly. The corridor ahead was so dark, our flashlights barely helped, and I wondered what we might find in the rooms up ahead. I walked into the main corridor with Brock, our flashlights lighting up the dark hallway. The corridor ran in both directions with open doorways along the walls. Water damage had left long stains down the walls, and chunks of plaster covered the floor under our feet. The cold hit me immediately, not just the December chill we'd felt outside, but something deeper that seemed to come from the building itself. I pulled my jacket tighter and watched my breath make small clouds in the light of my flashlight. "Temperature's dropping," I said, checking the digital display on my watch. "Feels like it's getting colder the further we go inside." Brock was already heading toward the nearest doorway, camera raised. "Probably just the lack of heating. These old buildings don't keep warm once the system's shut down." He went into what looked like a patient room and I followed. The space had 2 rusted bed frames pushed against opposite walls with no mattresses left. A small window near the ceiling was boarded up, but gaps between the boards let thin strips of outside light come through. Old medical equipment I couldn't name sat in corners, covered in dust so thick you could write in it. I started taking photos, getting the bed frames from different angles and focusing on details showing how long the place had been empty. A call button still hung from a cord beside one bed, its plastic yellow with age. Someone had scratched initials into the wall near the headboard, and I wondered if they were from a patient or a staff member. "Check this out," Brock called from across the hall. I found him in another patient room, this one with 3 beds arranged in a semicircle. Unlike the previous room, this space still contained personal items scattered across the floor. A pair of slippers sat beside one bed, and magazines from the 1980s lay spread near the window. Someone had left a small ceramic horse figurine on the windowsill. "They left in a hurry," Brock said, photographing the magazines with his camera flash. "Look at the dates on these. December 1987, right before the shutdown." We spent the next hour going through room after room, taking notes on what looked like a complete picture of hospital life just stopped in time. Each room showed us something new about the people who'd lived and worked here. Patient rooms had left behind clothes, books, and letters. Staff areas had clipboards with shift schedules still attached, and coffee cups sitting on desks like their owners had just stepped away. The nurses' station was really interesting. Charts and paperwork covered the main desk, some still held down by paperweights shaped like medical instruments. File folders with patient records were scattered across the floor, but water damage had made most of the text unreadable. A large scheduling board took up one wall, with patient names written in different colored markers to show treatment plans or meal requirements. I took photos of everything step by step, trying to catch the human stories in the abandoned place. Behind the station, medication charts hung from metal hooks, showing dosage schedules for patients with names I couldn't pronounce but conditions that sounded serious, even though I didn't have medical training. Brock looked at the administrative stuff, finding logbooks that tracked daily operations right up to the final entries. They were processing new admissions the day before Christmas, he said, pointing to entries in a bound ledger. Then nothing, like someone just turned off the lights and walked away. The building's acoustics bothered me more as we went deeper into the main floor. Our voices sounded muffled, like the walls soaked up sound in a weird way. Our footsteps were quieter than they should have been, even with all the junk covering most surfaces. I found myself talking louder than I needed to, just to hear my own voice clearly. "Sounds weird in here," I said, testing the acoustics by clapping my hands. The sound disappeared almost immediately instead of echoing like it would in other large buildings we'd explored. "Probably all the water damage," Brock replied, but I noticed he'd unconsciously started speaking louder too. Moisture changes how sound travels through a space. We continued documenting patient rooms, supply closets, and small offices that had served various medical functions. Each room told part of the same story. Normal operations interrupted suddenly, with no time for proper shutdown procedures. Equipment sat exactly where someone had last used it, and personal belongings remained scattered as if their owners expected to return the next day. The pattern stayed the same until we reached a corridor near the building's east wing. This hallway looked different from the others we'd explored. The walls were painted institutional white instead of the faded green that was all over the rest of the building, and the floor showed less water damage. The biggest difference was that every door along this corridor had signs, warning about authorized personnel only. I counted 8 doors total, evenly spaced along both sides of the hallway. 7 hung open, showing empty rooms with concrete floors and heavy-duty electrical outlets built into the walls. The 8th door, at the very end of the corridor, was still closed with what looked like a much newer deadbolt than anything else we'd seen. "This section feels different," I said, training my flashlight beam down the corridor. "Look at the condition of these walls compared to everywhere else." Brock was already studying the warning signs posted beside each door. Authorized personnel only. Restricted access. Medical staff clearance required. He photographed each sign carefully. These rooms were definitely off limits to regular patients. I walked up to the closed door at the end of the corridor and felt a chill when I saw what was taped to it. A piece of white paper with handwriting in red ink that looked way too fresh for a building that had been empty for decades. "Keep out. You are not alone." The message was written in block letters with what looked like a red marker or pen. Unlike everything else in the hospital, this warning had no signs of age, water damage, or fading. The paper looked new, like someone had posted it recently. "Brock, look at this." He joined me at the door, pointing his flashlight at the handwritten message. For a moment, his usual confidence stopped as he looked at the perfect condition of the warning. Then he laughed, though it sounded fake. Classic scare tactic. Some local kids probably put this up to keep other explorers away from whatever they found inside. I stared at the message, trying to make sense of its condition compared to the decay throughout the rest of the building. Everything else showed years of being empty. Water damage, mold, faded paint, rotting paper. This warning looked like it could have been written yesterday. "The handwriting's too fresh," I said. "Look at the ink. Look at the paper. This doesn't match anything else in here. So maybe someone posted it last week. Doesn't mean anything supernatural." Brock was already pulling his lockpick set from his cargo pants. Probably just another explorer trying to claim this room as their private discovery. I stepped back as he examined the deadbolt. The lock definitely looked newer than the original hardware, though it showed signs of weathering that suggested it had been installed months or years ago rather than recently. "We should respect the warning," I said. "Whoever left this message might have had a good reason." "Come on, Ryan. You know better than that." Brock selected 2 picks from his kit and began working on the lock mechanism. These buildings collect ghost stories like magnets. Every abandoned hospital in the country has locals claiming it's haunted. It's just folklore designed to keep people away from dangerous structures. He had a point about the stories. Every site we'd explored came with its share of supernatural rumors, usually based on nothing more than the building's dark history and the way empty spaces played tricks on people's imaginations. But something about this specific warning felt different, more immediate than the usual local folklore. I checked my watch and realized we'd been inside the hospital for almost 2 hours. The temperature seemed to have dropped even further, and I could see my breath clearly in the beam of my flashlight. The muffled acoustic quality that had bothered me earlier was becoming more noticeable, as if the building was swallowing up sound. "Maybe we should call it a night," I suggested. "We've documented plenty of material already." Brock paused in his lockpicking to look at me. "Since when do you want to leave early? This is exactly the kind of discovery that makes our reputation in the urban exploration community, a restricted area that nobody else has accessed." The lock clicked softly, and he smiled as he worked the picks like a pro. I was worried about the fresh warning sign, but I couldn't deny that Brock had gotten way better at picking locks since we started exploring together. He'd gone from clumsy fumbling to almost looking like he knew what he was doing. Besides, he continued, returning his attention to the lock, whatever's behind this door has been sealed up for decades. The worst we'll find is more abandoned medical equipment and maybe some files they didn't want regular staff to access. The deadbolt turned with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the muffled acoustics of the corridor. The deadbolt turned with a soft click, and Brock pushed the door open. I followed him into what turned out to be a small maintenance room, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with unpainted concrete walls and a network of exposed pipes running along the ceiling. The space felt cramped with both of us inside, but what struck me immediately was the temperature difference. The room was warm. Not just warmer than the corridor we'd come from, but actually comfortable in a way that made no sense given the building's condition. I pulled off my gloves and held my hands up, feeling heat coming from somewhere I couldn't identify. The pipes above us weren't warm to the touch, and I didn't see any obvious heating equipment. "That's weird," I said, unzipping my jacket partway. "Where's this heat coming from?" Brock was already looking at a metal shelving unit stuck to the far wall, his flashlight moving across various supplies and tools. Probably leftover heat from old boiler systems. These big old buildings sometimes stay warm in certain spots even after the main heating gets turned off. I wasn't convinced. The rest of the hospital had gotten colder the deeper we'd gone, with my breath visible in most rooms. This felt like walking into a completely different building, like someone had been running heaters recently. "Look at this," Brock called, his voice carrying more excitement than I'd heard all night. I moved closer to see what he'd found. There was a hospital map in a plastic sleeve on the shelf, way more detailed than anything we'd found online. The floor plans Brock showed me at the gas station were basic, but this map had exact room layouts, hallway measurements, and what looked like utility lines running through the whole building. Most importantly, it showed a basement level. Not just one basement level, but several subfloors with different colors marking them and detailed room labels. I looked at the layout with my flashlight, trying to make sense of what I was seeing compared to all my research from the past week. All the official documents I'd read said the hospital only had a small basement area with just basic utility rooms and storage. "This doesn't match anything I found in the county records," I said, tracing the basement layout with my finger. "Look at the scale of this. There's more space underground than on the main floors." Brock pulled out his phone and took several photos of the map, using the flash to capture details our flashlights might miss. The official records were probably simplified for public filing. This looks like an internal maintenance map with the real layout. The basement level was split into different sections, each labeled with functions that made me more and more uncomfortable. The eastern edge had rooms marked as morgue facilities with what looked like cold storage units. The middle area had lots of storage rooms, but the western section had something called Special Treatment Wing, with rooms numbered from ST1 through ST12. I'd never heard of special treatment areas in psychiatric hospitals, but the way they were kept away from the main patient floors and stuck in the basement made me think they weren't part of normal care. "Special Treatment Wing," I read aloud. "What do you think that means?" "Probably isolation rooms for patients who needed extra supervision," Brock replied, but his tone suggested he was guessing. "Or maybe experimental therapy areas." Psychiatric treatment was pretty different back in the 1980s. The map included notation codes along the margins that referenced utility systems, emergency procedures, and staff access protocols. Most were standard institutional abbreviations, but several caught my attention because they didn't match anything I'd encountered in my research about hospital operations. "Look at these access codes," I said, pointing to markings near the Special Treatment Wing. "Emergency lockdown procedures, staff evacuation protocols, containment system activation. This reads more like a correctional facility than a hospital." Brock looked at the codes more carefully, getting excited as he realized what they meant. This is exactly what I was talking about. Official records only tell part of the story. The real history is in documents like this that never made it into public archives. At the back of the maintenance room, I noticed another door that had been hidden behind the shelving unit until we moved closer to check the map. This door was made of thick metal with reinforcement brackets and multiple locking mechanisms. A faded sign read, "Basement access, staff only." I counted 5 separate lock housings built into the door frame, though most looked cut or broken. Metal shavings around the locks suggested someone had used power tools to break in, probably years ago from all the rust. Only one deadbolt still worked, though it looked like it had been used recently. "Someone's been down there," I said, examining the lock damage more closely. This wasn't natural deterioration. Someone deliberately cut through these locks. "Previous explorers, probably," Brock replied, but he was already pulling his lockpick set from his cargo pants. "Urban exploration community's been active in this region for years. Makes sense someone would have found this access point eventually." I stepped back from the door, feeling really nervous for the first time since we came into the building. The new warning sign we found on the outer door, the weird heat in this room, and now signs that someone broke into basement areas that weren't even supposed to be real according to official records. I didn't like where all this was heading. "Brock, we should call it a night," I said, checking my watch and realizing we'd been inside for over 2 hours. "We've documented plenty of material already, and this is getting into territory we're not prepared for." He looked up from his examination of the remaining deadbolt, his expression showing the kind of focused determination I'd learned to recognize over our years of exploration. Once Brock decided he wanted to investigate something, logical arguments rarely changed his mind. "Are you kidding? This is the discovery we've been working toward for 2 years. He gestured toward the laminated map. "Look at the inconsistencies between this layout and everything we found online. The official floor plans don't show any of these basement levels, but here's detailed documentation proving they exist." I looked at the map again, trying to figure out why it didn't match up. Buildings get changed and updated over the years, and not everything gets written down properly, especially for big buildings with lots of special needs. But the basement map showed the original building details, not stuff that was added later. "Maybe the records were deliberately incomplete," I suggested. "If they were doing controversial treatments down there, they might not have wanted detailed documentation in public files." Exactly. Brock had selected 2 picks from his kit and was already working on the deadbolt mechanism. This could be evidence of practices that were covered up when the hospital closed. Psychiatric institutions in the 1980s were doing all kinds of experimental procedures that would be considered unethical today. His lockpicking technique had improved dramatically since our first explorations. What used to take him 20 minutes of fumbling now required just a few minutes of careful work. I watched him work, feeling more and more unsure about going deeper into the building. The evidence suggested we'd stumbled onto something significant. Exactly the kind of historical discovery that made urban exploration worthwhile. But my research had uncovered enough disturbing information about the hospital's closure to make me cautious about areas that had been deliberately sealed off from public access. "Think about it," Brock continued, adjusting his pick angle to work around the deadbolt's internal mechanism. "We could be the first people to document whatever's down there since the official closure. This is the kind of material that gets featured in urban exploration documentaries." The lock clicked softly as the deadbolt retracted. Brock smiled and put his tools away, then gripped the door handle and looked at me expectantly. "You coming, or are you going to wait up here while I document the discovery of the decade?" Against every instinct that told me we'd already pushed our luck far enough for one night, I adjusted my camera bag and prepared to follow him into whatever lay below. Brock pulled the door open, and cold air rushed past us from the stairwell beyond. The basement access led to a concrete landing with steps going down into darkness. Our flashlights only reached a few feet ahead. I moved closer to the doorway and aimed my light downward, but the stairwell curved to the right about 10 steps down, so I couldn't see how far it went. A mechanical buzz came from somewhere below, steady and rhythmic like machines running on their own. The sound was weird, Not quite electrical, but not fully mechanical either. It reminded me of old equipment that had been running way too long. Probably just ventilation systems, Brock said, stepping onto the concrete landing. These institutional buildings usually keep emergency power running to prevent moisture damage in the basement levels. The air flowing up from below felt warm against my face, carrying a chemical smell that reminded me of hospitals, but sharper, more concentrated. Not quite antiseptic, but something medical that had grown stale over time. I pulled my jacket tighter even though it was warm, trying to identify the odor without much success. "Smells like old cleaning supplies," I said, though that didn't quite capture what I was experiencing. Maybe industrial disinfectant that's been sitting in containers for decades. Brock was already starting down the steps, his flashlight beam bouncing ahead of him as he tested each concrete step before putting his full weight on it. His exploration instincts had kicked in completely, and I recognized the focused way he moved when he'd found something that captured his interest. "I'll go first," he called back up to me. "These stairwells can be tricky in old buildings. Better to have someone who knows how to check for structural problems leading the way." I watched his light move steadily downward, counting each footstep as he went around the curve in the stairwell. The mechanical buzzing continued from below, and occasionally I heard what sounded like his boots scuffing against concrete as he fixed his footing on the steps. 15 steps. 20. 25. The sounds of his movement faded gradually until I couldn't tell his footsteps from the background noise that filled the stairwell. His flashlight beam had disappeared completely around the curve, leaving me standing at the top of the stairs with only the warm air and chemical smell rising from the darkness below. I waited, listening for any sign of what he'd found at the bottom. The mechanical drone seemed to change slightly, not quite regular enough to be completely automatic. Sometimes it would get louder for a few seconds, then go back to normal. 3 minutes passed, maybe 4. I checked my watch, trying to guess how long it should take him to reach the bottom of the stairwell and start looking around whatever basement area waited below. "Brock?" I called down into the darkness. My voice carried down the stairwell, but the concrete walls seemed to absorb the sound just like the rest of the building had been doing all night. I waited for his response, expecting to hear him call back up with his usual enthusiasm about whatever discovery he'd made. "Come down immediately." His voice came back up the stairwell, but something about the tone made me pause at the top of the steps. The words sounded flat, completely lacking the excitement or curiosity that typically marked Brock's voice when he found something interesting. No inflection, no personality, just the basic sounds of the words themselves. "Is everything okay down there?" I called back. "Come down immediately." The exact same words, delivered with identical tone and timing. Not just similar to his previous response, but identical in a way that made my skin crawl. Like someone had recorded his voice and played it back twice, matching every aspect, perfectly. I stepped back from the stairwell opening, feeling really panicked for the first time since we'd entered the building. Something was wrong with the way Brock was responding, wrong in a way that had nothing to do with structural dangers or abandoned equipment. The mechanical buzz grew louder, no longer steady but getting stronger and faster. And underneath it, I heard Brock screaming, a horrible sound of fear and pain that traveled up the stairwell for several seconds before stopping suddenly. Then his voice called up again, still in that same flat tone. "Help me." But the total lack of emotion in the words, the way they sounded exactly like his previous responses, made it clear that whatever was calling to me from the basement wasn't my friend at all. I stepped back from the basement entrance, my hands shaking as the flat voice repeated the same words again. "Help me!" The tone hadn't changed at all, perfectly identical to the previous calls, like someone playing a recording on loop. Then I heard it clearly, multiple voices speaking in unison from the darkness below, all of them using Brock's exact tone, his inflection, his vocal patterns, but layered together until it sounded like a chorus of identical speakers. "Come down immediately. Come down immediately. Come down immediately." The mechanical buzzing got louder, so strong that it made the concrete floor shake under my boots. And underneath that noise, footsteps started coming up the stairwell. Not just one person, but several, all walking together in step like they were marching. I counted the steps as they got closer. 10, 15, 20. Too many people moving as one, their boots hitting the concrete at the same time with each step upward. My flashlight shook as I backed toward the maintenance room door. Whatever was climbing those stairs wasn't Brock, and it wasn't human. The voices continued their chorus from below, now adding new phrases. Is everything okay down there? Is everything okay down there? Help me. Come down immediately. Every word spoken in Brock's voice, but combined into a conversation that had never happened. Phrases lifted from our earlier exchanges and repeated endlessly by the climbing figures. I ran. Slamming the maintenance room door behind me, I sprinted down the corridor toward the administrative wing where we'd entered. My flashlight beam jumped wildly as I ran, lighting up broken plaster and debris scattered across the floor. Behind me, I heard the door bang open with tremendous force, metal slamming against concrete with a crash that bounced through the building. The footsteps followed immediately, but they sounded different now. Not synchronized anymore, but chaotic, like dozens of people running at once. The sound filled the corridor behind me, growing louder with each second. Something was wrong with the building itself. The hallway stretched ahead of me, longer than it had been when we'd walked this route earlier. I recognized the water-stained walls and scattered plaster, but the distance between landmarks seemed to have doubled. The nurse's station that should have been 30 feet ahead stayed just out of reach no matter how fast I ran. Doors appeared along the walls where I didn't remember seeing them before. Patient rooms with numbers that didn't match the layout we'd documented. Supply closets in positions that made no architectural sense. My flashlight beam grew weaker as I ran, as if something was eating the light before it could reach the walls. I passed the same filing cabinet 3 times, scattered papers spilling across the floor in an identical pattern. The broken ceiling tile near the main corridor intersection repeated every few yards, multiplying down the hallway. The temperature dropped rapidly around me. My breath became visible in sudden puffs of vapor, and frost formed on the walls. The cold cut through my jacket and gloves, making my hands numb as I held the flashlight. Behind me, the pursuing footsteps grew closer. I risked a look over my shoulder and saw nothing but darkness, yet the sound of running continued, along with the chorus of voices calling my name. Ryan. Ryan. Come back, Ryan. All in Brock's voice, but wrong, like recordings played at slightly different speeds, so they overlapped and created a creepy mix. I reached a corridor junction that didn't exist in the floor plans Brock had shown me. 3 hallways branched off in directions that made no sense with the building's rectangular layout, each going into complete darkness. I chose the path that felt most familiar, hoping it would lead back to the administrative wing. The patient rooms I passed were different now. Instead of the scattered belongings and medical equipment we'd documented earlier, these rooms had fresh flowers in vases, made beds with crisp white sheets, and personal items arranged like patients had just stepped out for a minute. Warm light shined from each room, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. My flashlight died completely. The beam blinked twice and went out, leaving me in total darkness except for the strange light coming from the patient rooms. I tried to open the battery compartment, but my numb fingers couldn't do the simple job of changing the batteries. The footsteps behind me stopped suddenly, making a silence that scared me more than being chased. I stood in the dark hallway, listening to my own breathing and the distant mechanical noise that kept going from somewhere below. Then I heard Brock's voice right next to my ear, so close that I should have felt his breath on my neck. "Where are you going?" I bolted forward, running blind down the corridor with my hands extended to avoid colliding with walls. The patient room lights provided enough illumination to navigate, but cast strange shadows that moved independently of my passage. Finally, I saw known landmarks ahead. The reception desk, where we'd found the appointment book, The overturned filing cabinets, the office space with the broken window frame. I'd never been so relieved to see destruction and decay in my life. The window opening looked exactly as we'd left it, 4 feet off the ground with rotted wooden frame and missing glass. I threw myself through the opening without checking the landing area, crashing into the snow outside with enough force to knock the wind from my lungs. Cold air hit my face hard. I rolled away from the building and scrambled to my feet, looking back at the hospital. Every window remained dark and silent. No light shined from within. No sounds escaped through the broken glass and gaps in the boarding. I kept running toward the tree line where we'd parked, my boots slipping on patches of ice hidden beneath the snow. The distance seemed enormous, much farther than the 200 yards we'd walked earlier. My legs grew heavy and unsteady, but I didn't stop until I reached the pine trees. Our cars sat exactly where we'd left them, Brock's beat-up Honda beside my sedan. The keys were still in my pocket, my camera equipment somehow still secured across my chest after the frantic escape. I leaned against my car door, gasping in the cold air and staring back at the hospital. The building looked completely normal from the outside. Dark brick walls, boarded windows, sections of collapsed roof exactly as they'd looked when we'd first approached hours earlier. No sign of the chaos I'd just escaped. No indication that anything inside had changed or moved. My legs gave out, and I collapsed into the snow beside my car. The cold soaked through my clothes immediately, but I couldn't find the strength to stand. Every muscle in my body felt drained, as if I'd been running for hours instead of minutes. I pulled out my phone to call for help, to report what had happened to Brock, to get search teams up here immediately. But when I looked at the screen, the display showed no signal. Not even one bar, even though we'd had full coverage when we arrived. The hospital windows remained dark and empty, but I had the feeling that something inside was watching me, waiting to see what I would do next, whether I'd be foolish enough to return for my missing friend. I knew I should go back for Brock. Every instinct told me I couldn't leave him in that place, trapped with whatever was mimicking his voice and calling from the basement. But my body refused to move toward the building. Some deeper survival mechanism had taken control, keeping me frozen in the snow rather than approaching that hospital again. The mechanical buzz continued, so faint I might have imagined it, drifting across the snow from the direction of the hospital. My head hurt like crazy, as if I'd been knocked out cold for hours. I opened my eyes and immediately regretted it thanks to the bright lights above that seemed designed just to torture me. I tried to figure out where I was and why everything hurt so much. White ceiling tiles, the smell of antiseptic and floor cleaner, machines beeping steadily nearby. Hospital room, obviously, but not the abandoned one I'd been running through hours earlier. This place was clean, working, very much in use. I tried to sit up, but quickly stopped. My muscles hurt like I'd been hit by a truck, and my head spun so badly I had to lie back down on the narrow bed. Through the window beside me, I could see downtown Millfield spread out in the valley below, which meant I was in the modern hospital on the south side of town. A middle-aged man in a police uniform sat in a plastic chair near the foot of my bed, writing notes in a small notebook. He looked up when I moved, his face professional, but not unfriendly. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Officer Carter with the Millfield Police. How are you feeling?" "Like garbage," I said, my voice coming out rougher than expected. "What happened? How did I get here?" Officer Carter set his notebook on his lap and leaned forward slightly. "We were hoping you could tell us. A couple found you unconscious in a snowbank along Route 9 around 6:30 this morning. David and Emily Anderson. They were driving to work when they spotted you about half a mile from the old hospital site." I was shocked by what he said. I remembered running from the building, reaching my car, passing out in the snow, but Route 9 was miles from where we'd parked. I couldn't have walked that distance, especially not after getting away from the hospital. "I was at my car," I said slowly, trying to piece together what had happened. "Behind the pine trees near the old hospital. Brock and I parked there before we went inside. Officer Carter picked up his pen again. Tell me about Brock. When did you last see him? The question brought back a rush of memories. Brock disappearing down the basement stairs. The voices calling back up in his tone. The chase through corridors that stretched and changed around me. I started talking, explaining everything from our arrival at the hospital through my escape from the building. Carter wrote steadily as I spoke, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. When I finished describing my escape through the window, he set his pen down and looked at me closely. Mr. Mitchell, I need you to understand something. We conducted a thorough search of the abandoned hospital yesterday after we were notified about your condition. A full team went through the entire structure. Did you find Brock? I asked, though something in Carter's expression already suggested the answer. We found no trace of him. No footprints in the snow around the building, no signs of forced entry through any windows or doors. The building has been sealed for safety reasons, and all access points were secure. I stared at him, waiting for more information that would make sense of what I'd experienced. What about the window on the south side? The one with the missing glass where we climbed through? All windows on the ground floor are boarded up and have been for years. The boards show no recent damage or removal. Carter consulted his notes. You mentioned a basement access through a maintenance room. According to the building records in our search, no such room exists. The hospital's basement levels were filled with concrete in 1995 during demolition preparation. Those words hit hard. Everything I remembered, everything I was sure happened, apparently didn't exist. The maintenance room with the laminated map, the door with multiple locks, the stairwell going down into darkness. That's impossible, I said. I was there. I saw the floor plans, the basement layout with the special treatment wing. The rooms numbered ST1 through ST12. Carter's expression remained neutral, but I caught something in his eyes that might have been concern. Mr. Mitchell, there's something you should know about that building's history. The old hospital has been the subject of numerous urban legends and false stories over the years. He looked at several pages in his notebook before continuing. The facility was built in 1923 as a general hospital, but it included a psychiatric wing that operated until 1987. During those decades, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, there were significant problems with patient care and treatment methods. I waited for him to continue, my mind still confused about the disconnect between my memories and the evidence he was describing. State investigators found evidence of systematic abuse, unauthorized experimental treatments, and unexplained patient deaths. Most of the problematic activities occurred in basement treatment areas that were supposedly sealed off from the main hospital operations. Carter looked directly at me. Dozens of patients died under suspicious circumstances before the facility was permanently closed. The state investigation revealed that staff had been conducting treatments that violated every ethical standard for psychiatric care. So the basement levels did exist, I said, seizing on this confirmation. They existed then, but the building has been empty since 1987, and the basement areas were filled with concrete years ago to prevent exactly the kind of unauthorized access you're describing. Carter closed his notebook. Mr. Mitchell, we'd like you to accompany us back to the building. Sometimes seeing a location in daylight can help clarify what happened during a traumatic experience. I agreed right away, wanting to show that what I'd experienced was real. An hour later, after a doctor let me go, he cared more about my hypothermia than my story. I sat in Carter's patrol car as we drove up the curvy road to the abandoned hospital. The building looked exactly like it did Friday night. Dark brick walls, boarded windows, parts of the roof caved in. But when we walked to the south side where Brock and I had gotten in, every window was completely boarded up. The wooden boards looked old and weathered, with no signs anyone had removed or damaged them recently. This is where we got in, I said, pointing to a window that looked identical to all the others. The glass was missing, and the frame was rotted. Carter checked the boards carefully, running his hands along the edges. These boards have been in place for years. The nails are rusted solid and the wood has weathered to match the rest of the building. We entered through the main entrance, which Carter unlocked with keys from the city. Inside, the administrative wing looked similar to what I remembered, but wrong in small ways. The office where we'd climbed through the window had an intact window with boards securely fastened from the inside. The reception area had the same scattered papers and overturned furniture, but arranged differently than I remembered. When we reached the hallway where I'd found the maintenance room, Carter looked at a building schematic. The hallway ended at a blank wall where the door should have been. No room existed in that location according to the official layout, and when we looked at the wall, we saw solid brick construction, with no sign of any door ever being there. "The basement access you described isn't possible," Carter explained, tapping the schematic. "This section of the building was constructed as a single-story wing. There's no basement beneath this area, and there never was." I stared at the wall, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with my vivid memories of the maintenance room, the laminated map, the heavy door that Brock had picked open. Everything I remembered happening in this exact location apparently couldn't have occurred. Standing in that corridor, surrounded by evidence that contradicted my every recollection, I began to understand why Carter and his team had found no trace of Brock's presence. According to the physical reality of the building, we'd never been here at all. I traced my finger along the edge of the missing person report for what had to be the 100th time since filing it 3 weeks ago. The paper had gotten soft from handling, creased where I'd folded and unfolded it during sleepless nights when I'd pull it out just to confirm the words were still there. Brock Sullivan, age 24, last seen Friday, December 15th. The official police report sat underneath it, typed on letterhead that made everything sound clinical and final. Investigation concluded. No evidence to support reported circumstances. Subject likely experienced psychological episode due to severe hypothermia and prolonged exposure. Officer Carter had been professional when he delivered the news, but I'd caught the look in his eyes. The same expression people get when they're trying to be kind to someone who's clearly lost it. My apartment felt smaller than it had before the incident. I'd been spending most of my time here, avoiding campus and the questions from classmates who'd heard about what happened. Word travels fast in a town like Millfield, especially when it involves the old hospital and someone getting found half frozen on the side of the road. The private investigator's report came in yesterday. 3 pages of methodical documentation that confirmed what everyone already believed. Margaret Sullivan had hired him after the police closed their investigation, desperate for answers about her son's disappearance. His findings were thorough and depressing in their simplicity. Brock had told his roommate Friday afternoon that he was going urban exploring. He'd packed his camera equipment and lockpicks, same as always. Then he'd vanished completely. No one else had seen him that night. No security cameras had captured his car on any roads leading to the hospital. His credit cards hadn't been used. His phone had gone straight to voicemail since Friday evening, and his social media accounts had gone silent at the exact moment he'd supposedly called me about the hospital expedition. I'd read through the investigator's timeline dozens of times, looking for gaps where Brock's presence might have been missed. But the man was competent, maybe too competent. He'd tracked Brock's movements right up until Friday afternoon, then found nothing. No trace of where he'd gone or what he'd planned to do that evening. The disconnect between my memories and the documented evidence had been eating at me for weeks. I could recall every detail of that night with perfect clarity. Brock's excitement as he'd spread the floor plans across his car hood. The way his flashlight beam had bounced off the hospital's brick walls as we'd approached. His lockpicks clicking against the deadbolt in the maintenance room. But according to everyone else, none of it had happened. I'd started questioning everything. The conversations we'd had about the hospital, the research I'd done in preparation for the expedition, even the phone call where Brock had first mentioned finding the location. Maybe I'd imagined all of it during some kind of breakdown, created an elaborate scenario to explain why I'd ended up unconscious in the snow. But the timing didn't work. If I'd suffered a psychological break, when had it started? I remembered the entire week leading up to Friday night, filled with normal interactions and routine activities. My photography professor had complimented my latest assignment on Thursday. I'd grabbed lunch with my roommate earlier that week. Everything had been completely ordinary until Brock's call. What bothered me most wasn't the missing evidence or the skeptical looks from people who'd heard my story. It was the growing certainty that whatever had called to me from that basement stairwell hadn't been Brock at all. I'd replayed those moments hundreds of times in my head, analyzing every detail I could remember. Brock's voice saying, "Come down immediately," with that flat, emotionless tone. The way the words had been identical each time, not just similar, but perfectly reproduced like a recording. Real people don't speak that way, especially not Brock, who'd never managed to say the same thing twice in exactly the same manner during all our explorations. The screaming I'd heard had been genuine, raw with terror and pain, but the voice that followed, calling for help in Brock's inflection, had carried no emotional content at all, just the mechanical reproduction of human speech patterns without any understanding of what the words meant. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet, I sometimes heard that same voice calling my name from outside. It would drift through the windows, barely audible, but unmistakably present, using the exact tone and pronunciation that Brock would have used. The first few times, I'd rush to the window to look for him, thinking maybe he'd escaped whatever had happened in the hospital and come to find me. But the voice never came from a specific direction. It seemed to originate from the darkness itself, floating across the parking lot and residential streets without any source. When I'd call back asking where he was or if he needed help, the voice would repeat my name once more, and then disappear completely. I'd started keeping the windows closed and locked, even though the heating bill was becoming a problem I couldn't afford. The sound still managed to seep through somehow, muffled but persistent, always occurring in the dead hours between midnight and dawn when rational explanations seemed impossible to maintain. My research into the hospital's history had consumed most of my free time over the past 3 weeks. The local library's archives contained more information than I'd expected, including newspaper articles from the 1960s and 70s that detailed the problems with the psychiatric wing. Patient advocacy groups had filed numerous complaints about treatment conditions, and state investigators had documented evidence of unauthorized experimental procedures. The basement treatment areas kept appearing in the records, even though Officer Carter had insisted those levels had been filled with concrete years ago. Internal hospital memos from the 1970s referenced the special treatment wing and its 12 individual rooms, using the same ST1 through ST12 numbering system I'd seen on the laminated map. Staff reports mentioned containment protocols and subject preparation procedures that sounded more like prison operations than medical treatment. Most disturbing were the patient testimonials buried in the state investigation files. Multiple individuals reported hearing voices in the basement, claiming something lived in the treatment rooms that could perfectly imitate anyone's speech patterns. The patients described being lured deeper into the facility by familiar voices calling for help, only to discover the sounds came from empty rooms or areas where no one could possibly be standing. Dr. Margaret Hensley had been particularly interested in these reports. Her notes suggested she believed the patients were experiencing shared hallucinations brought on by the stress of their treatment environment. But several staff members had corroborated similar experiences, describing voices that mimicked patients and colleagues with unsettling accuracy. The investigation had been terminated abruptly in 1987, when the hospital lost its state certification and was permanently closed. Most of the staff had relocated to other facilities, and the patient records had been sealed by court order. Dr. Hensley had disappeared entirely, leaving no forwarding address or contact information with the state medical board. I'd tried to track down some of the former staff members mentioned in the articles, but most had either died or moved away from the area decades ago. The few I'd managed to contact by phone had been reluctant to discuss their experiences at the hospital, often hanging up when I mentioned the basement treatment areas. One retired nurse had been willing to talk briefly before she'd realized what I was asking about. She'd worked in the psychiatric wing from 1975 to 1982 and remembered the voice incidents clearly. According to her, the episodes had become more frequent in the years before the hospital's closure, with patients and staff reporting identical experiences involving perfect vocal imitations of people they knew. It started in the basement, she'd told me before ending the call. Whatever was down there learned to sound like anyone it wanted. The administration tried to explain it away, but we all knew something was wrong with that place. Some buildings just collect darkness, and that hospital had been doing it for decades. The building still stood on that hill outside Millfield, officially empty, but never really abandoned. I'd driven past it several times over the past 3 weeks, always during daylight hours when the normal part of my brain could keep it together. The building looked exactly as it had the night we'd checked it out. Dark brick walls and boarded windows with no signs of change. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside was waiting, probably calling to other urban explorers with voices they'd know and trust. Young people looking for adventure, pulled in by the same stories that got Brock and me interested. The building being known as haunted would just bring more people in danger. Folks who'd brush off the warning signs as local tall tales until it was too late. Brock was still missing, not dead, not moved away, not hiding somewhere while getting over what happened. He was gone like he'd never even been real. There was proof he existed in his apartment, and his family was heartbroken, completely lost about what happened to him. I folded the missing person report and put it back into the folder with the other papers I'd gathered. Police reports, what the investigators found, hospital records, newspaper stories. A paper trail that proved something had happened, even if no one could agree on what it was. Tomorrow, I'd probably drive past the hospital again. Not to look into it or try going inside again, but just to make sure it was still there. Still waiting for the next bunch of curious people who'd ignore the warnings and go into places that should have stayed closed up. Whatever had taken Brock was patient. It had been waiting in that basement for decades, learning to copy human voices and pull people deeper into the empty parts of the building. And it would keep waiting, calling out in voices that sound familiar to anyone stupid enough to listen and answer back. The voice outside my window had been quiet for 3 nights now, but I knew it would come back. It was probably working on getting Brock's voice just right, practicing how he talked until it sounded so real that even I might start to believe my friend had somehow made it back from whatever got him in the darkness below.